We begin with the European Union's response to Russia's attack on Ukraine. Since the conflict began on the 24th of February, the bloc has announced 6 rounds of sanctions that officials say are squeezing Moscow's revenues. But Italian Prime Minister and former President of the European Central Bank, Mario Draghi, says EU members are not putting their money where their mouth is.
There is no official pronouncement of what it means to breach sanctions. It's not, nobody's ever said anything about whether rubles payments breach sanctions or not, how these payments are organized. So it's such a gray zone here. And as a matter of fact, the largest gas importer in Germany has already paid in rubles. And as a matter of fact, most of the gas importers have already opened their accounts in rubles with Gazprom.
While EU members are seemingly unwilling to turn off the taps on Russian energy immediately, Brussels says it's got a plan to end the EU's reliance on Moscow by 2030. It's setting aside $205 billion to boost domestic production of fuels, as well as to improve the efficiency of various industries so they consume less energy. As part of its drive to boost the supply of renewables, Brussels aims to produce 10 million tonnes of hydrogen gas domestically, while importing another 10 million tonnes. And its Innovation Fund plans to sell carbon permits and use the revenue to invest in biomethane plants. The EU wants to produce 35 billion tonnes of the renewable natural gas.
We have understood that economic dependencies do not bring security if the aggressor simply does not care about the well-being of its population. That's why we are resolutely reducing our dependence on Russian energy to zero and forever. We need a reform of the European Union, a further deepening of its membership. That too is the lesson of this brutal war of aggression.
Well, let's get more on this now with independent energy analyst Neil Atkinson in Paris. Good to have you back on the program, Neil. Can I start by asking you about Russia's latest attempt to further punish Europe over its sanctions against Moscow? We saw gas prices surge more than 20% after Russia's Gazprom decided to cut flows through Europe, through the key Yamal pipeline, which runs from Russia to Germany via Poland. What impact will that have on Europe's gas supplies?
Well, the impact is not quite as dramatic as it was first feared when we saw the headlines come up. It is a cutback, but it's not at the moment too dramatic. And I suspect that what's happening here is that Russia is beginning a period now where it's starting to tease or even taunt its Western European customers by pointing out that it does in fact have a huge power over them. And, you know, sanctions work both ways. The European Union can spend all the time it likes setting up sanctions packages against Russia, but Russia has the ability to impose its own sanctions on the West almost literally overnight. So at the moment, it's not too dangerous. We are, of course, heading into the summer season, so there's less demand for gas for heating purposes. But this is a demonstration of the power that Russia does actually have if it chooses to use it in a malevolent way.
And now to Europe's response, because for a while now we've heard the EU say that they are really looking to seriously cut itself off from Russian energy, and we've got some draft documents of a proposed $205 billion EU plan that will ultimately phase out fossil fuels from Russia by 2027. It's a combination of both a faster rollout of renewable energy and energy savings, as well as a switch to alternative sources of gas. From what you've seen so far, we know we've only seen the draft documents. Do you think this plan will work in the longer term?
Well, I think something that's quite reassuring about this is that the European Union is not actually starting from scratch. It's not starting from zero, because obviously for many years now, it's had many, many plans to decarbonize the energy sector in Europe. So to some extent, what the EU has announced, or the plans that we're looking at in this discussion, in some respects build on what is already there. And it's an effort to accelerate the pace of those programs that already exist by bringing in more money to speed up the investment and to try and achieve a little earlier what they're actually setting out to achieve in any event. It's ambitious, it's on a big scale, and there's an awful lot can happen between now and then. Governments change, of course, in Western Europe after elections. So it's ambitious, it's quite impressive, but as always, the devil is in the detail.
And of course, part of the appeal of Russian gas up until now was the fact that the infrastructure is already there and it doesn't really have to travel a huge distance. But now the EU wants to look at alternative sources of liquefied natural gas from countries like Israel, Libya and Egypt. Do you think that plan will also work? Is the infrastructure even there, and how long will it take for those sources to come online, do you think?
Oh, it could take years for some of these sources. And of course, I mean, one of the countries you mentioned in that little list was Libya. Now, Libya is not a stable entity, and to put too many eggs in the Libyan basket, I think, would probably be a big mistake. We already know that European Union countries are looking to source much greater supplies from the United States of LNG. They're looking to source more natural gas or LNG from Qatar. The German government has been particularly proactive in that respect. And they're essentially looking at anybody that has the possibility to send more gas to Europe to do so, particularly, of course, with the upcoming winter season. But the problem with that is that Europe is not the only place that requires LNG. And there are growing markets for LNG in the Asian developing economies. So to some extent, there's going to be something of a bidding war. But it's not just LNG because, well, LNG is a problem because not all European countries, and Germany is the most prominent, have the LNG receiving facilities already in operation. And the Germans have an enormous challenge to bring on stream 4 or 5 plants as soon as they can. But it's the countries that don't have access to LNG, countries such as Hungary, the Czech Republic, where we are essentially landlocked and are tied into pipeline infrastructure, which only points essentially from one direction, which is from Russia. So that's a huge challenge as well.
And the European Commission has always said that their sanctions on Moscow, we know there have been 6 rounds of sanctions so far, they'll remain in place until Russia remains in Ukraine, essentially until the end of the conflict in Ukraine. Do you think that if and when the war does end, will there be a temptation to go back to business as usual? Or are we now at a turning point where even when the war ends, the EU will no longer want to depend on Russia in terms of its energy?
Well, it's hard to define what the end of the war means, but let's leave that aside for a moment. Well, one point about that, does Russia getting out of Ukraine include Russia leaving the whole of the Donbass and the whole of the Crimean region? I don't know the answer to that question. But if some sort of end to hostilities does take place, but Putin remains in power, it is very, very difficult to see how there could possibly be a return to business as usual, because he's no longer reliable and predictable. If by some miracle Putin were to leave power, either voluntarily or involuntarily, and a new Russian government were to take office, which offered some kind of assurance and guarantee that Ukrainian sovereignty would be respected, then possibly we could get back to some kind of business as usual, which would then relieve the European Union and individual countries from the enormous burden of making these major investments in alternative sources of energy from Russian gas. So in some respects, maybe they would welcome an end of the war, but nobody knows at the moment when the war will end, what the landscape will look like when that war ends, and whether Putin will still be in power.
Okay, Neil Atkinson, really good to get your analysis as always. Thanks you again for joining us.
My pleasure.